A very good morning. We are dealing with psychology elective course. That is especially with educational psychology. And yesterday we have been dealing with some of the aspects of the concept of education as such, the problems one has in education, and how to overcome the problems that are seen in the field of education. We also try to see what is the scope as well as the aims of education and how there are a number of problems associated with education in the contemporary India, and how can we overcome these such problems. And we know that the psychological aspects of education do help in overcoming the problems. And it is here that we are trying to understand the role of psychology in solving the education problems in India or elsewhere in other countries. Now we know that the psychology is one of the most important fields where it can influence people and educational systems. So psychology has indeed influenced education in a number of ways. And also we know that a skillful teacher or any good curriculum in a country requires a knowledge of educational psychology. Now, if we consider what is educational psychology, it's what we call a admixture of both fields of education, that is education as well as psychology. And here we study the development of an individual within an educational setting, that is with emphasis on teaching learning processes. In a classroom, we see that the teaching learning process occurs. Individuals appear in the schools for learning purpose. And here in this process, we know that either knowledge is gained and also behavior is modified or changed. So this process of trying to modify the human behavior is known as the educational psychology. So the educational psychology tries to modify the human behavior. We can understand the human behavior, we can predict the behavior, and we can also see that the students are able to learn something. That is, their behavior can be changed suitably so that education has this goal of trying to change the individual or individualistic behavior towards a desired goal, which may be anticipated by the nation, by the country, and the community. So here we use the principles of educational psychology to actually train the students or modify their behavior or try to incorporate such psychological principles in the classroom teaching, where teaching learning processes do indeed get affected by the underlying principles of psychology. We know that the individuals differ. Individuals differ in various features like their intelligence, their personality, their mental health, their abilities, interests, etc. Now, psychology tries to look into all these various spheres of life, and we try to suitably modify these things so that the individual is able to live happily and more amenable to the circumstances and more understanding. Now, for example, consider extension education. For example, in the agricultural extension activities, we try to improve the knowledge of the rural workers, either agricultural laborers or what we call the multi-purpose health workers in various fields. And for this, for continuous knowledge, we try to bring in certain attitudinal changes. And for this, we try to modify their behavior towards the other people in the society so that they'll be able to incorporate this knowledge in their day-to-day working, like either in farming or when they work in the with other people in social activities, like as a multi-purpose workers do. Now, this extension education psychology tries to influence the workings of the persons, like the agricultural farmers or the multi-purpose health workers, nurses, ancillary workers, etc. Now, these will, when we try to modify their behavior, we'll try to incorporate certain principles. So here, we are trying to change their behavior so that they can have other effects on other people. Similarly, this is the extension education psychology. Likewise, we can also have psychological principles while teaching in a classroom. Now, if we understand the term psychology, psych means soul. It is derived from the Greek word. In the Indian terms, it is known as the Atman. Now, nearly 2,500 years ago, we tried to learn something about the soul, and this has become the science of the soul. Psychology is the science of the soul. But gradually, the terms has changed. So originally, the soul was thought to be capable of thinking, imagining, reasoning, etc. But then, for a period of time, the definition of psychology has changed. Now we know that logos means science and psych means soul. Therefore, the study of soul is known as psychology. But here, later, the psychology term tried to involve, it tried to understand the workings of the mind, and therefore psychology became the study of the mind. Later, after a period of time, it is considered as the study of the consciousness. Now, William James is a person, a philosopher, basically. He tried to say that the psychology is the science of consciousness. And also we have other people like William Wundt, who tried to talk about the behavior, and which is a conscious behavior of the person, which is the study of the psychology. We know that the Watson is another person who tried to understand the behavioralistic aspect of psychology. And J.B. Watson is a contributor of a person who said that the behavior, that the observable behavior of a person can be seen, and from that behavior, their internal leanings or consciousness or their workings or feelings can be worked out. A behavior is indicative of the person's feelings. That is how we have seen that the psychology, which was originally started as a study of the soul, has gradually transformed itself into the study of the mind, and gradually into the study of the consciousness, and then into the study of behavior. Now, if we try to understand psychology, what it studies human and animal behavior. It is a positive science of human experience and behavior. Here, positive means it studies what is observable nature, and it tries to study what exists in reality, not it as a form of conception or imagination. What is existing in reality is studied. Therefore, this is known as the positive science. Now, psychology also has several methods, scientific methods, which actually try to describe, understand, and we try to also understand, predict, and control the human behavior. Now, psychology is generally considered the science of mind. If we consider educational psychology, now this, as I said earlier, is a mixture of, it's a field where both the fields of education as well as psychology they are integrated together. Now we know we actually always learn throughout our lives, and we also see other people learning. Now, when we try to teach others, what we are doing, we are trying to incorporate what we have learned in other persons. It may be this learning, teaching, learning aspects may be seen in the family, with the parents, with neighbors, or with anyone. But generally in the classroom, this is more predictable behavior is seen. When we approach a student with a particular aim and objectives and try to incorporate learning in him, we find this is a process which is being done consciously and with a voluntary effort, and therefore this becomes a professional aspect or a sophisticated type of thing. And here the teaching becomes institutionalized. That is, the whole school tries to accept this sort of psychological process of trying to educate the young minds with certain psychological principles behind them, so that there is an obvious goal of getting the learner educated. Now here, this is a conscious formal sort of processing, and therefore it has certain problems. Not all classrooms have the same level of psychological principles being applied, but then we know that the psychological principles underlies all learning activities as such. Now, how psychological principles contribute to education becomes the field of educational psychology. Now, this is an applied science. Psychology becomes applied science in the sense that we have certain principles with regard to learning. We have certain principles with regard to the teaching experiences to be provided, the teaching processes, the learning outcomes, and therefore, this is a conscious effort to actually mold the child. Therefore, what we call is This thorough knowledge of the psychological principles underlies all learning activities. Now, therefore, this is called as an applied science. Educational psychology is therefore a behavioral science which contributes to both the updation of technology as well as we use technology here to enrich the learner's perspective. And therefore, the principles as well as the technology what we use in a classroom have psychological principles as a basis. When we consider the behavioristic aspects, there are certain needs for educational psychology in the classroom. For example, if we want to change the behavior of a student, now, this behavior can be of several types. If you try to understand the students' behavior in a classroom, sometimes we find the students being exploratory. They try to see and verify what happens in an environment. Sometimes they're impulsive. They act rashly. They try to do whatever they wish. Sometimes they voluntarily do some things. Sometimes you see their behavior being involuntary without knowing, without their own control, they'll be doing certain things. Sometimes the behaviors are learned. Sometimes they are reflexive. That is, you try to actually instill something in them and they react to it. So here you are giving a sort of stimulus to them and therefore they react upon it. Therefore, it's a reflex. So when a teacher asks a question in the classroom and the student comes out with an answer, it's a reflexive sort of thing. And here also sometimes we see the learning is purposeful in the classroom. Sometimes we see the emotional behavior in the persons. Sometimes there's a patternized type of learning, a systematic type of thing where according to a particular sequence of steps, you can try to develop learning in the children. Some learners we find are risk-taking. Sometimes we find that the education what we may give may not be remembered all throughout. So it needs to be reinforced. So here, sometimes we see the modification of behaviors and the shaping of behavior in the classroom where the teacher tries to develop particular sorts of behavior in the classroom. What I'm trying to get to you here is, we see a number of behavioristic concepts where a teacher gets involved in the classroom and the learner is made to do certain things. So we see that there is reflexive sort of teaching, there is patternized sort of teaching, the learners can be risk-taking, the learners can be exploratory. So there are all different types of behavior which a teacher has to see in a learner in the classroom. Now, the aims of educational psychology is to understand such behaviors, predict how a person behaves in a particular setting, and tries to control which are unwanted behaviors and see that good behaviors, that is good learning behaviors, are developed in the child. So we see that the educational psychology deals with basically three types of what we call basis or basic things which underlie it. One is trying to change the behavior. The second is sometimes we see that the humanistic psychology plays a role. That is, we know that all human beings are supposed to be interpreted according to their feelings, inner feelings and interpretations. A person, when he's actively engaging in his environment, when a person is actually is motivated according to his feelings and according to his experiences, we know that a person also grows in a nurturing environment where his feelings are developed. So when we think from a humanistic perspective, we would like all individuals to develop. So here, the inner concept or the inner consciousness or mind needs to be developed. And this is what is thought as a humanistic psychology, where we have to understand the human needs, feelings, and perceptions, and they have to be developed. So the educational psychology has a behavioristic perspective, as we were telling earlier, where the behaviors need to be modified. We also have to think about the humanistic perspective, that is, there should be a common ground of understanding others and being considerate for other human beings. And also there is another perspective known as the cognitive perspective of development, that is trying to improve their brain or trying to improve their knowledge. Now, we know that the definitions of educational psychology are many. For example, Crow and Crow the person's educationist talks about the developing or explaining the learning experiences of an individual through birth, from birth through old age. What are the different stages they pass through? Every stage, they are able to learn something. So educational psychology is the sum total of experiences, or the educational psychology tries to describe and explain these learning experiences which occur from birth to death. That is from throughout the different stages. Then we know that educational psychology is a branch of psychology which deals with teaching and learning. That's what Skinner talks about. He talks it about from the learning perspective. Now, Trow is a person, he says the psychological aspects of educational situation. What are the underlying psychological aspects in an educational setting? That is known as educational psychology. Stephen talks about the educational growth and development in a child. Now, Collins talks about the educational psychology as a study of those facts and principles of psychology which actually try to explain and improve the process of education. Now, while general psychology is a pure term which tries to embrace the whole sort of psychology, educational psychology is a specific discipline which tries to apply psychological principles to the field of education. Now, Judd talks about it as a science which changes the place of the individuals as they pass through the various stages of development. So here, the educational psychology can be considered, and the different definitions talk about the role of psychological principles forming a basis of the development in the individual, and this development occurs throughout the various stages of the human life, and they try to educate the person. So the mix or the cross between the a leveling field where we have the education uses psychology is known as the educational psychology. Now, if we consider what is the nature of educational psychology, we know that it is a science because here we collect the data of how students are studying, what is happening, or in the classroom, or when a teacher teaches, what happens. Now, how much attention is there, or how much forgetfulness is there, how learning is enhanced, and we actually collect the data of how students are scoring. Now, this sort of collection of data comes under the purview of science, and therefore psychology, educational psychology is also considered a science because it tries to understand a particular educational setting, explain about the factors or the learners who are there in the educational setting, and it tries to predict as well as control the behavior of the students. Therefore, educational psychology is such a field where it has the scientific aspects or ingredients, and therefore educational psychology is also thought to be somewhat similar or akin to science, because in science also we collect data, we collect different settings, we try to understand a particular situation, we try to predict what happens if we make some interventions, we try to do some experiments, get the data, and accordingly we try to change the settings. Similarly, in educational psychology too, we try to analyze the situation, analyze the factors, collect the data, and apply this data or apply this knowledge in the betterment of the particular classroom or in improving the learner skills. But educational psychology is also thought to be a natural science. This is because here we investigate the data and also we draw the conclusions exactly as we do in any science field. Now, it is also known as a social science. There is a problem in psychology as such. It is considered as a science on one hand and as a social science on the other hand. And therefore, here the educational psychologist, we said, because it collects data, has some scientific method involved in it, and collects the data, and it is analyzed, interpreted, and applied in the classroom, that is a science. But it is also a social science in the sense it is studying the human beings, and also it has a social aspect. We also see what is the social effect of having education or not having education, or how to improve the children. Or for example, if we consider in the COVID-related situation, how the educational has been affected by some other factors. So education also has a sort of what we call a social setting or a social background. Here in that sense, we can say that the educational science psychology is also a social science. Now it is a positive science. Educational psychology is called positive science because we know that we study the situation as it is. It's not an idealist thing we try to consider. We are trying to see how actually it happens in a society, or what are the realistic perspectives, what is the reality in the society, and we study it from the facts as they are existing. So if we study from the reality of facts and we check the reality, and that is known as the positive science. It is not that when we study actually about the children's behavior, it is as they are existing. It is not it is not a figment of imagination. We are not trying to imagine something. Therefore, it is known as a positive science. Educational psychology is also applied in the sense, whenever we have the certain basic understanding of a subject about psychology, we are trying to apply all these principles, or what we call the laws of psychology, to classroom situation, and therefore this is known as an applied field. Now, this is very much a growing field. Many research findings talk about the type of learning settings we should have, the type of experience we should have, the type of technology one should have in the classroom, and the ideal gap between periods, the ideal gap between different settings, or the ideal gap between curricular and extracurricular activities. And we also talk about the child's nature, behavior, and what role the technology has, and how one can influence, the teacher can influence the children, etc. So this is also a continuously growing field. Educational psychology is a growing field. Now, W.A. Kelly talks about the nature of educational psychology. He says it is studies, it gives the knowledge about the nature of the child, because ultimately it is the child which is to whom the educational psychology is applied in first instinct. Of course, a child, when he learns, he applies it throughout his life. So here the educational psychology is generally targeted at the child initially. Now, it also gives about the general nature of education, the aims of education, and the purposes of education. The educational psychology also has to study these aspects, because here we are dealing with psychology as well as education. So the psychological principles have to understand the goals of education. When we understand the goals, we can apply the principles. The educational psychology also talks about different scientific methods and procedures that can be followed in the classroom for betterment of learning, and also about what sort of techniques of learning and teaching one can use in a classroom. We talk about the abilities or educational achievements of children. How do we measure, or how do we know what sort of achievement has occurred? This we know by actually evaluating the students. So evaluation is also comes under the perspective of educational psychology. That is, we try to measure the students' abilities, how they have been enhanced, and how a child has improved. That sort of knowing how much a child has improved in his knowledge or skills comes under, by measuring that we know actually, that is how we measure, by marking or grading, and therefore all these processes come under the evaluation. We also see how the child grows and develops in a particular educational setting. Sometimes all children are not able to adjust to the educational system. Then if there are some maladjustments, that also are studied, why all children are not able to fare on an equal footing, and why certain children get maladjusted. That also is studied under the educational psychology. Sometimes we know that the emotions also play an important part. We have three aspects. One is dealing with knowledge, the other is with skill or motor abilities, and sometimes we also have emotions. So these emotions also should be trained. This emotional training also comes under the purview of educational psychology. We know that to understand or to develop a stream of motivation or conscious learning in the children, it requires training. So unless it is trained, a person may not be able to have a disciplined sort of understanding of the knowledge. So training is that process in which the skills are developed, skills of knowledge, by putting a individual in a continuous set of circumstances which make them get involved in that particular activity and learn about it. So unless training is given, education is a general term, but training means sticking to a particular timetable and trying to master a skill. So such sort of training also requires that what we call, it also requires the psychological principles as a basis. Now, if we try to understand the scope of educational psychology, or what are the areas under which the educational psychology tries to deal with, we know that the behavior of the persons or the children in the classroom and the persons who are concerned in the educational development of the children, that is teachers or the educational managers, administrators, all these come under the ambit of the educational psychology. The educational content as such, the curriculum, what we want to teach them, the human behavior, how we are trying to develop knowledge in persons, in trying to consider the different ways with which subject is made easier to the students, the different skills that are need to be imparted, all these come under the field of educational psychology. And the scope of educational psychology is said to deal with the learning process, as well as the different strategies that are observed or that are taken recourse to while teaching. For example, consider the learner. The learner is in different developmental stages. So depending on the developmental stages, the learner has to be taught. Sometimes we know in a classroom that the learners are not all of the same ability. The individual differences persist. Now, these differences may be of several types. Some may be with age, some may be, the differences may exist with regard to the gender. Of course, it is known a fact that the gender is a common individual difference, but there are also differences existing with regard to the interests, abilities, understanding, family background, and socio-economic background. So the learners vary, and the learners' variations are seen in the individual learners. We also see that the learners have different personalities. This is maybe temperamental, they may be different, and the personality differences may also be attributable because of the family background or other reasons or environmental influences or genetical reasons. So the learners, when we actually talk about educational psychology, the main part, what we call the scope of the educational psychology actually tries to deal with the learner. The next is the learning process. That is what happens in a classroom to the learner. That also comes under the purview of the educational psychology, under the ambit of the educational psychology. That is, educational psychology also tries to deal with the learning process. Here we talk about the learning process. We talk about the acquisition of knowledge, skills, attitudes, interests. We talk about the retention of knowledge, because what we acquire, they do not retain. So retention means they have to keep it in their mind. It has to be there for a longer time. Now, retention also means you have to use suitable techniques with which you have to make them more understanding. And that requires the usage of several examples or aids. Now, using so many things, you can make the knowledge stay for a longer time in the student. And that is known as the retention. Retention means trying to remember it for a longer time. So it is dealing with the process of memory. So acquiring knowledge, retaining it for a longer time, and again using it, that is applying it or transacting in different situations, all these come under the scope of the educational psychology. There are also strategies being followed. Now, these strategies are followed with regard to, as I was saying, with measurement or evaluation. Sometimes after getting evaluation, you try to label a student as good or bad, or we try to understand the student as being an underperformer or an overperformer or a good performer. And based on these characteristics, one should try to guide or counsel the students. If one is a bad performer, a learner is not able to do, we either evaluate the situation and try to remedy the teaching, or we'll try to develop in the learner certain additional skills by additional teaching. So the scope of educational psychology deals with the learner and his own nature, and also the individual differences of different learners or of different types. And along with the learner, the scope of educational psychology also deals with the learning process in the classroom. What happens in the classroom, what learning experiences one gets, and also we are trying to deal with the strategies of either how we go about in the classroom, as well as trying to evaluate them, as well as the methods by which we try to guide and counsel them so that if there are any lapses, if there are any what we call underdevelopers, we may be able to develop them by developing a suitable mechanism. We are able to strategical methods. We can try to develop the individual and rectify whatever lapses they may be, whatever lacunae they may be, whatever what we call underdeveloped features there are there in the classroom. Those can be rectified and the individuals can become better in their learning. Now we know that the scope of educational psychology, besides the learner learning process and learning experiences, also deals with some other aspects like the teacher. The teacher also is also a psychological being. He has his own motivation, anxiety, adjustment, aspirations, etc. We know if a person knows himself, he is able to help others. So the teacher also should be a psychological practitioner. He should know the principles of psychology. He should know how to help the children. So his personality and his interests, his traits, his character, and his aptitude for the subject, his interest in knowing the learner, his motivation for developing learning in the students, all these also help the classroom setting. And also under the psychological, educational psychological ambit come the human behavior. The human psychology is the study of the human behavior, and education is completely dealing with the modification of behavior. And on one hand, we talk about psychology as the modification of behavior. Is the principles of behavior. Education talks about the modification of behavior. So obviously they are interrelated, because educational psychology tries to deal with using psychological principles for modification of human behavior. In the educational psychology, we also talk about various things like growth and development of an individual, because depending on the age or the growth of a person, the learning abilities, motivations, interests, all these change. So growth and development, heredity and environment, and the personality, nature and development, all these come under the scope of educational psychology. For example, we talk about a well-adjusted personality. A well-adjusted personality means he has all-round development. That is, he's able to do well. He's doing well, what we call physically, mentally, spiritually, as well as emotionally. And if he has such a characteristics, he is said to be having all-round developed personality. We also talk about the individual differences and the differences in intelligences between different people under the educational psychology. Now, intelligence is also measured, and we have the measurement known as IQ or intelligence quotient. Educational psychology also provides guidance and counseling. It is not enough if we measure the individuals and if we find some problems in them, we should be able to tell them how to modify their behavior, which may be learning behavior sometimes, and help them to become an individual with all their potentialities developed. For this aspect, we have to take the help of the educational psychology. Now, when we try to relate both education and psychology, we know that the psychology originally was a branch of philosophy, and it then became a social science. Gradually, it was thought to be a science. Now, therefore, we know that the psychology became an independent study of it in its own right. It became a separate discipline in the early part of the century. Now, when we consider about the scientific roots of psychology, education is the process which enables the individual to distinguish between what is good and bad, what is true and false, and what is right and wrong. So if a person is able to distinguish these features, then we call him, he's educated. He should know what is right, he should know what is truth, and he should know what is right, what is true. Now, here, educational psychology is a systematic study of the growth of the person, especially educational growth. Now, the psychological principles which are there in existence can be used in education too. When we talk about the J.S. Mill was an educational person in the early 19th century. He talked about using psychology as a branch of education. Now, of course, psychology is not a branch of education. It has evolved into a separate field. Now, here we know that the education tries to improve the human nature and human experiences, as well as we'll try to obtain certain ends or means. We talk about aims and means of education with respect to the individual and with respect to the society. That is, the societal expects a well-adjusted individual, and the individual tries to gain education and his development of the full potentiality. That is the getting certain ends, that is aims, and we talk about how to go about it, and that is the means. So education talks about means as well as that is the processes, and ends, that is the goals. It is the goals that determine the processes, and it is the learning teaching processes that determines the obtaining the or reaching the end goals. But here with psychology tries to be practical, and it talks about understanding the human experiences, the human knowledge, how to enhance one's understanding, etc. So now both these are intricately related. Now, why should we study psychology in education? Because we know that the mental abilities of the children can be enhanced only if you try to understand their psychology. Education, as I said earlier, tries to deal with aims, ideals, and standards, whereas the psychology tries to know whether these aims, how they have to be achieved, and whether they have been achieved or not, or whether they're attainable or not. Education tries to know the teacher also. Education psychology talks about the child. As well as here, education tells you that the teacher should know the child before he tries to use the principles of learning. So here, knowing the child also forms the basis of education. Psychology helps to actually make some efforts and apply the suitable teaching strategies to the classroom. So psychology actually helps you to form a suitable curriculum and helps you to adopt different methods of teaching in the classroom. It helps you in the formation of the textbooks, because all the textbooks are also formed with psychological principles in their mind. For example, you cannot try to teach different concepts for a young child. Therefore, they come from the rules of simple to complex. So simple things are taught first. Similarly, there has to be some logicality in how they are being taught. So the psychological principles of trying to teach simple things first, and according to their age, as well as trying to make them logically understanding their thing from simple to complex, all these are there in the formation or in the writing of a textbook also. So psychology tries to influence the curriculum, psychology influences the textbooks, psychological influences are also seen on the teacher, where he tries to use these different principles or strategies for development or the enhancement of learning experiences in the classroom, and psychological principles of using audiovisual aids, how to improvise the education or how to make the contribution of the teacher more richer by using certain aids in the classroom. And all these are dependent on psychology. When you consider when the timetable in a classroom, the timetable is fixed in such a way that the subjects, abstract subjects like mathematics or sciences are given in the morning, and the subjects in the timetable in the afternoon are given as such as languages or literary activities, so that they are easier on the mind. So there are the mind is more active in the morning. So how the timetable is framed in a particular school is also based on the psychological principles. We know that the school administration, how it deals with parents, how it deals with discipline, how it tries to make the student understand particular aspects, all these are dependent on, again, the school administration principles are dependent on psychology. So discipline is actually not the physical discipline, but mentally accustoming the students to forms, observe certain rules, and so that it will help in the betterment of the learners. So discipline concept is also dependent on the psychological principles. How a school adopts a particular disciplinary measures is dependent on some schools are very lenient, while some schools try to be very harsh, which may not be good for the children. So the psychological principles of adjustment, that children's age and their motivational levels and their understanding, all these are also dependent on the psychological principles. We know that the evaluation or measurement or correction of children's and trying to give them feedback or trying to understand one's achievement, and there are a number of such psychological principles which are also underlying the evaluation aspect. So therefore, we can say that the educational psychology tries to what we call cover a whole range of aspects which deals with a cross section of education as well as psychology. Psychology tries to predict behavior. Education has certain aims. So educational psychology is such a field where it tries to develop the individual, and it also tries to know how and why we behave or the children behave in a particular manner, try to understand the reasons underlying certain actions, underlying certain feelings, underlying certain behaviors, and try to actually develop them and use the knowledge of psychological principles for the betterment of the individuals and for bettering the knowledge and skills of a child. Because the childhood is an important span or developmental life, what we call developmental lifespan. And here that there are certain tasks of learning to be achieved. The educational psychology tries to incorporate all these features, all those principles which are there and which are modifying and which are getting researched upon. And they use these in the classrooms for the benefit of the learner. That's what is the scope of the educational psychology. Now, let us consider the aspect of individual differences. We know that all individuals develop, but even individuals all also try to learn. Therefore, learning is a modification of the behavior. But when we go into a classroom, we observe that all learners are not of the same type. This is because some individuals are able to learn faster and modify their behavior. Some individuals are slow learners. Now, this ability of some learners learning quickly and some not able to learn is dependent on the individual differences. We know that the individuals in differences are there in nature, and as there is variation, so many differences are seen in nature, in plants, animals, and fruits, flowers. And likewise, we also see that the biological differences or hereditary differences are also seen in the human beings. And therefore, individuals do differ in their size, shape, length, width, and the other aspects of size, shape, appearance, and also the speed of reaction if it comes to the mental abilities also. They also vary in their behavior, personalities, etc. Now, this is a common feature. This occurs because of the hereditary variations. Now, if we consider the concept of individual differences, it's not only the physical differences we see, we also see the differences in the mental traits. We also see that the individuals also are different in their emotional responses. Now, we also know in the classroom, we find certain students are able to react quickly, while some students take time. Some students are able to remember things for a longer time, some forget quickly. Some respond quickly in the classroom, while some students are not responding quickly. Now, these variations within an age group can be seen from the number of the groups. And these differences, if we try to consider on what we call the probability, when we generally find that mostly at a particular age group, they tend to be near the mean. That is, generally some average type of tendencies are seen in individuals, but sometimes there are much variation seen within a group also. We find sometimes high learners with great thinking abilities and great intellectual abilities, and we also sometimes see some learners who are not very much, they do not have at all any knowledge, or they may be lacking in certain intellectual abilities much way beyond the average members of the group. Now, these characteristics may vary with regard to mental ability or their knowledge or their habits, their personality, character, etc. Now, if we say the types of individual differences, we see the individuals differ from other individuals of the same age group with regard to their feelings also. For example, some may exhibit more anger, fear, happiness, enjoyment, and some may have less happiness, enjoyment generally. And we also find individuals varying with feelings like jealousy and also their anger, fear. And some individuals generally have certain social skills less, while some students have more social skills. That is, they are more friendly. Sometimes we see some individuals being introvert, they stay alone, aloof by themselves. And whereas some students we find extroverts are trying to interact with others. Within the same individual, the intra-individual differences are also seen in the sense some individual may express their feelings at some times, they may not be expressing at some time. They may be volatile at some point, maybe showing anger at some point, they try to restrain themselves. We also know that the emotional stability is also not same throughout the period or throughout a lifespan for individual. Emotional stability may also vary. Now, this shows that the emotional balance a person may show in some condition. The same emotional balance may not be shown by the person in some other condition. So, depending on the time and situation, sometimes the differences in the same individual may be seen. This is known as the intra-individual differences. So, depending on the differences, we can also talk about the differences of two types. One is differences which come about in individuals because of genetical reasons, like the physical appearance, the mental condition, the temperament. All these may be dependent on heredity, and sometimes the individual differences may arise because of the acquired characteristics of environment. This also may be cultural, educational type, and emotional traits, because depending on the family background or the environment which they have been accustomed or cultured, we find according to the cultural setting of their families and the emotional traits exhibited by their parents, the emotional settings, the social setting of their family, we also see that the individual differences also vary. Now, if we consider the different types of individual differences, we find, as I was saying earlier, the physical differences. These physical differences may be seen with regard to height, weight, skin color, eyes, the color of the hair, the size of the hands or legs, and the size of the what we call the mid-rib, or the size of their waistline, depending on the structure and functioning. Also in the internal organs also, they may not be the similar type in all individuals. The internal organs may also vary in their size. And the facial expressions, the mannerisms of speech, the mannerisms of walk, and the hairstyle. With all these, we find the differences seen in different individuals. These are the physically seen differences, physically manifested differences. But then we also find that internally the mental traits also differ, in the sense we find differences in the intelligence. We know some people are very intelligent, are able to get along with people as well as their problem solvers, whereas some people who have some less intelligence, sometimes more than the average intelligence, their intelligence may dip a lot. That is, the intelligence may be lesser than that of an average intelligent person, and we call them as, based on their intelligence levels, as idiots. So the IQ levels are there. For example, the normal range would be somewhere between 60 to 110. But if the intelligence is more above the normal, above the average, they are known as the supernormal intelligence, that is above 120. And if they are very less, from 0 to 50, they are known as the idiots. So depending on the intelligence levels, we have classified the people as genius, near genius, very superior, superior, average, backward, feeble-minded, dull, and idiot. These come under various categories. And therefore, intelligence is also a factor which is in which people differ. The other attributes in which people differ are in their aptitudes. Aptitude is such a character, or it is an individual's ability to learn something. That is, the individual may have some potential, and if he is given enough training, there is a scope that he may excel in that. That is known as the individual's abilities or skills with which, if they are trained sufficiently, they may prove worthwhile and they may excel in that. That is known as the individual's aptitude. Attitude is, which is different from person to person. We differ in our attitude towards people, situation, organization. It's a mental bent that is known as the attitude. Sometimes people have a positive attitude, and sometimes people have a negative attitude towards things. So attitude is your mental bent of looking at things, how your mind is construed to think in different ways. Now, this is also dependent, how attitudes are formed is again dependent on the familial background or the environment with which one is grown. But aptitude is the innate ability which, if trained, can lead to excellence in something. Now, the personality is also formed. We know that the personalities are of different types. Some are sociable, some are unsociable, some are introverts, some are extroverts. Now, all these types of personalities, people do differ. People differ in their personalities, people differ in their attitudes, people differ in their aptitudes. Now, these are all contribute to the individual differences. We know that the people also differ in learning. All the people do not learn to the same extent. Now, some have good grasp and memory, while some do not have good grasp. They do not show much interest. Now, the learning may be dependent on various factors, but it is also to be considered that individuals do differ in their learning. Now, coming to achievement, some people, even though learn well, they have this feeling to excel in something. So individual achievement levels also vary. We know that some people are good achievers in reading. Some people are good achievers in mathematics. So now this is because the various factors of intelligence as well as the experiences of the educational background or how motivated they are, it leads to educational attainment or achievement. So achievement is how one fares or one does in a given situation. Now, achievement also is dependent on various factors. Also, individuals differ in their motor ability. Certain individuals are able to do certain skillful things. They all require their motor skills, that is using their heads, hands. They are able to use their muscles and their skeletal features. And here they are able to get some things done physically. That is known as the motor ability. Now, here some people are able to do all the mechanical tasks easily, while some are not adept at doing the mechanical tasks. Interests also vary. So another aspect where we see the area of individual differences, interest. Some people are more interested in something, while some people are not interested. Now, this interest is dependent on factors like the family background, the level of development, and the differences between the races and the nationalities dependent on it. The interests in what we see or perceive in individuals also differ. We know that the emotional differences are also seen in people. Some people get angry quickly, while some people do not get angry, and some people are aggressive, some people are not, somewhat submissive. Sometimes we find certain individuals get so angry because of their hormones or because of the what we call they do not have sufficient control on their emotions. They can do some violent things, whereas some people are cool enough to laugh about things which make them angry. We also find that the gender differences exist. In spite of what we say about the equality of the people between men and women, the gender differences are seen, and McNamara talks about the differences that exist between a girl child and a male child, or the female and the male child. And he says the women have greater skill in memory, whereas men have greater motor ability. McNamara and Terman also talk about the handwriting of women is superior compared to men. They also talk about the women showing skill in sensory distinctions. They are good at aesthetic sort of thing. They are good at touching and smelling, whereas men ability comes from being reactive, or they are able to grasp the differences in size, weight, etc. Now, women are supposed to be good at languages, while men are supposed to be good at sciences. Women are supposed to be good at mirror drawing, and also they are good at imitative and their imitation, and the women are also said to be good at languages and also in speech, whereas men are found to be lacking in speech and are found to be making 3 times mistakes in speech compared to women. Now, women are also susceptible to suggestion. That is, if somebody suggests something, they are able to take the suggestion and try to develop, whereas men are not so much what we call susceptible to suggestion. And it is also a known factor that the men are more colorblind than women. 3 times colorblind are seen, 3 times color blindness is seen in men compared to women. Now, young girls are said to be more interested in romantic stories, fairy tales, etc., whereas men are said to be interested in the stories which are concerned with stories of science, bravery, or about occupation, war, and also something dealing with defense, etc. But now these are supposed to be, this theory is subjected to the what we call criticism. It is mostly from a sociological point of view, this may not be true, and it is the environment which have an influence. But in spite of the criticism on the theory, we know that gender differences are a part of the individual differences, and differences do exist between different individuals, and the same concept of individual differences can also be applied here. Now, the traits of individuals do differ. And what are the reasons of the individual differences? As I was talking from a long time, the color of the eyes, hair, type of the skin, shape of the skull, size of hands, the color blindness, or the baldness seen in men, all these are dependent on hereditary factors or genes. It is a hereditary trait, and also intelligence, abstract thinking, interests are all also dependent on hereditary factors or genes. Now, environment also has a what we call a bearing on the individual differences. Depending on the personality, how a person develops, personality is, we can say, it's the outcome of mutual interaction between heredity as well as environment. Environment has a bearing and heredity has bearing, and how a person develops is what we call an outcome of both these factors. That is, it is a mutual interaction between heredity and environment. Now, we know that the people also differ. One of the major differences besides gender is the age. Depending on the age, the individuals also vary. The more mature an individual is, the more better he is at emotional stability, the better he is taking it responsibility. So age also has a bearing on the individual differences we see. We know that the more older a person becomes, the more is his adjustment, the more is his learning capacity, the more is his social control, emotional control, and also the more is his way of looking at social responsibility. Education is another aspect with which individuals differ. That's why when somebody, an educated person, makes a mistake, we say, you are educated, then how is it you are making a mistake? So because education means that he has learned the problem solving skills and logical thinking, and also rationality, and also accuracy in predicting things, which is, they are able to judge the situation better, they're able to take better decisions. So an education also is a reason for individual differences we observe in nature. Now, if we come to intelligence, intelligence is the ability to learn quickly, adjust quickly to any social situation, and also it is the global capacity to think rationally, purposefully, and deal effectively with one's environment. This is the definition of David Wexler. And we know about Jean Piaget, who has talked about cognitive development during the different developmental spans. He says, intelligence is the ability of an individual to adjust with his physical and social surroundings. Now, intelligence is also the ability of the individual to think abstractly. The intelligent quotient is a sort of a score which tells about how much intelligence a person has. Now, this is defined as intelligent quotient. IQ is mental ability divided by chronological age into 100. Mental age is the age with which a person acts, and the chronological age is the physical age. Most of us have the normal intelligence between 90 to 110 IQ ratio, but generally the persons having more than 140 or 150 are called as genius, whereas the persons having less than 40 or 50 IQ are known as idiots, because they are not able to even carry out the normal day-to-day activities, and they have a problem with certain things, which we will talk about. The persons having the lesser abilities under a special chapter. Now, the aptitude. What is the aptitude? As I was saying, it is the innate potential of an individual to deal with certain things. Aptitude is a condition or the characteristics which will tell us what an individual will do later after getting some training. It is a symptom-like thing. So if we consider aptitude, for example, some people have an aptitude for mathematics, some for music, some for science, but provided with certain training, they're able to achieve excellence. And interest is only a motivating force which helps to do something. Now, it may be likes or dislikes. Interests are conditioned stimuli which are related to attainment of the goal. So if you have interest, you will be dealing with certain things, you will try to pursue certain things, and development is shaped by interest. Now, interest may be both hereditary as well as environmentally induced. Interest can be permanent. Interests are unique to an individual because every individual has his own interests. So he may like or dislike particular things, objects, or characteristics. Now, values are also another aspect which is seen in individuals, because individuals differ in the individual differences may be with regard to attitudes, aptitudes, interests, and values also. And values are what? Values are socially approved desires or goals. That is, when people get experience, they get knowledge, they also associate certain worthiness with things, and that becomes value. Values are conscious and unconscious motivators and justifies actions and judgments. If we say, why do you have acted in this? One person may say, it is my value which made me do that. So now, what are the sources of values? How do people get values? They may get either from print media or social media, or from their families, or from their religion, or from the history, or from the books they have read. Now, these may be the different sources. So originally they may be from parents, but actually, depending on the sources of knowledge, one person may form different values. Now, the values are the standards of the morality. They help you to go beyond a specific situation, and values are permanent. They're learned from many sources, and they help actually, one may have values about ideas or objects. For example, one may have environmental values, behavior. So all these tell us about the value. Also, values may vary from culture to culture and from person to person. So the differences in values also cause individual differences, but there are different types of values. Some may be personal values, some may be moral values, some may be aesthetic values. Regarding the academic achievement, we also find that how a student does in a school or a classroom is dependent on their interests, their motivation, their family background, and the skills and abilities of the students. So we can say that the individual differences, the concept of individual differences has both educational implications. We know individuals differ from the psychological point of view, but in a classroom setting also, one should know that all the individuals differ from each other, and that the aims of curriculum, the aims and the methods of teaching that are taken in the classroom, and the number of activities you give in the classroom, the learning experiences you create, as well as the curricular and extracurricular activities you try to build upon in the classroom, and the different types and methods of teaching you follow in the classroom, and what are the different types of aids or teachings, or the types of what we call teaching learning experiences we provide in the classroom. All these are dependent on the educational psychological principles. So the educational implications of individual differences, we should know that all individuals are not same. They do differ in the different aspects, and these individual differences may be overcome in a classroom by a teacher by adopting the psychological principles of teaching, by using the teaching aids, by having the curricula suitably modified according to the individual needs and according to the individual spirit or the individual development of the scope of the child. Although there are certain common principles of development, one should know that these individuals are persistent in the classroom, and therefore that is the reason for differences in individuals, and an educational psychology must try to develop all the individuals and cater to these individuals. And it is here that the psychological principles of education are a big help. Thank you.